Hi guys, welcome back into the shop. This is going to be a kind of a little more formal lesson on the jointer today. What I want to do is review a bunch of things that are really important on this machine. Has to do with us machining boards that we get in the shop. And it's important that you guys understand the difference between the two. Why would you use this piece of equipment? And the most practical and more importantly, the safest way to work on this machine is what I'll try to go over in this video. First of all, let's take a look at the boards in the shop. If you look at the wood pile, you probably have noticed that if this is your first project, you're working with the material up top, which is pine. If you look at the pine that we have here, they all have machined edges. All the boards line up absolutely perfectly even. And of course, the reason why pine is machined this way is because it's a fast grower. It's relatively inexpensive. It's not really very cost prohibitive to use that when we use the operations of fine furniture making in the shop. What you are probably going to do is start with that material, work with it, get to know it a little bit, and then usually most people will transition to hardwoods. The best thing about a hardwood, it's more durable. The finish usually is a lot cleaner. Hardwoods will last the test of time. Pine, on the other hand, being a softwood, it looks great, finishes well, stains well, but over time it gets dinged, it gets dented. It's much softer than the hardwoods that we have in the shop. Hardwoods are sold to us as the board runs. So if you look at the pine, that stacks up really nice. If you look at these pieces on the rest of the shop rack, you will notice that all of these are different widths. They're all the same thicknesses. I got that sent to us from the sawmill to be machined down to 13/16 of an inch in terms of the thickness. But all the widths of all these boards are all different. Rarely do you have 2 or 3 pieces that are exactly the same. Come over with me, I'll show you. If you look at the ends of this stack of walnut, you'll notice a board this wide, a board this wide. These two kind of look pretty much the same. You have a board that's probably about 6 inches wide over here, one that might be about 7 inches over here. They're all different widths. With them being different widths, they're sold to us as the tree runs. So with that in mind, we get a piece of hardwood that usually looks like this. The surfaces look nice, but the edges look terrible. This is a terrible edge. This one is worse. This is how the tree grows. So when they cut this in the sawmill, however the profile of that tree was, is what we get. So a lot of times you'll see this live edge. You'll notice that there'll be bark on it sometimes. It's as the tree runs. Well, why isn't this machined the way pine is? Because oak, walnut, maple, ash, cherry, all of these hardwoods always are slow growers, which means time is more important on this board than it is on a piece of pine. Time on a piece of pine's life is usually about 21 to 23 years. They can plant a tree, a seedling. It grows after about 21 to 23 years. They harvest it and they sell us the material. With oak, it's usually between 25 and 50 years, closer to the 40 mark. So when you look at this board took 40 years to grow, pine only about 20. I would probably guess that this might be about twice the price of a piece of pine. In relation to that, when you have something like maple, maple is a really slow grower. Also, cherry, walnut, which are all in short supply, they will take longer to grow. So as a result, there's that phrase, time is money. And that's true. We are going to get the tree as it grows. So when it's sent to us, they'll surface it down, cut it into boards, but they say, well, if you could afford this, you could afford the equipment to machine it, and that's what we have. I introduced to you the jointer. This jointer is the one piece of equipment in the shop that's original to the school, which means that in 1937, this thing was placed at this very spot, and it's still working. It is an Oliver machine, which means Oliver was always the Rolls-Royce of woodworking machines. So your shop was equipped really well in 1937. The difference between the jointer and a machine like the table saw has to do with the operation that they're used for. If you look at the table saw, which has a blade, and we come over here and compare that blade to the jointer, you're going to notice that the jointer does not have a blade. There's no blades over here. Now, I'm no idiot, so I'm going to take my pencil mark out, and I'm going to turn this. And what you can see is something that looks very similar to a chisel. This right here is a cutting knife. There are 3 cutting knives located on this cutting head. When we turn the machine on, the head spins, the knives spin, and what it does is it will plane down or even out the edge of the board that you put up against the table and the fence. And that's how you get a 90-degree angle on the edge of your board. If I look at the board that I have and the one that I showed you, you'll notice this edge looks really, really bad. This one not as bad. So the first rule that I want to do in my head is to think, which edge of these 2 do I want to join? And I want to joint the better of the 2. So I look at this, and this will take me forever to get this nice and even. This edge, probably a lot less time. More importantly, you always want to look at a board and notice if there's any deformities or anything in here that you should make sure that you avoid. Things like staples. When we order material, a lot of times we'll get pieces of paper that are laid on our order and stapled into the board. People will take the paper before we get it, rip the paper out, and then staples remain on the edge. It doesn't happen often, but sometimes you will get on our hardwoods knots like you have on a piece of pine. If I have a knot, I really want to avoid that. I don't want to join a knot. I don't want to join a staple. I don't want to join glue. If there's glue on here and we run it across the knives of the jointer, it's going to dull those knives. So what I want to avoid: glue, knots, nails, screws, bullets, because I've seen people shoot boards, shoot trees. They go to the sawmill, come over here, and there'll be a bullet in the tree. You want to avoid bullets, just like Elmer Fudd. Anything that's bad, I want to avoid it. With that in mind, on this edge, I want to joint the better of the 2 edges, which happens to be this piece. With pine, if I look at a pine board, you're going to notice that we have machined edges on both, because that's the way it's sent to us. My question to you is, do I need to joint an edge on a piece of pine? And most people would say, no, it came to us from the sawmill already cleaned up. Absolutely true. I have a board of pine. Do I need to joint this edge? Yeah, or as we say in Linden, hell yeah. Because if you look at this, this looks bad. So the general rule of I don't have to joint any edge of pine only applies to you looking at it. And again, the thinking is the hard part. I'm looking at this saying, do I have to joint that edge? Well, if I need to keep that edge and I want to clean it up, the only way I'm going to do it is either joint it or cut it on the table saw. So again, you have to look at this and use your head as opposed to saying, he said I should never joint an edge of pine. Only if it came to you from the sawmill and it looks good. If it looks bad, you clean it up as you see fit. Let's look at some terms on this machine. On our jointer, we have a guard, which is the most important part of it because it prevents your hands from going in to this cutting head and the knives. The other part that I have is a fence. Anytime you have a machine, and this will be the question on your little quiz today, anytime you have a fence, what does that mean in terms of how that machine is used? The answer, any machine that has a fence is meant to cut straight lines. It's true on the table saw, it's true on the miter saw or the chop saw, it's true on the jointer. The jointer does not give us irregular cuts like the bandsaw, the disc sander, the spindle sander. Those don't have fences. Only things with fences are requiring you to make sure that you're cutting straight. So I have the fence, I have the guard. On-off switch on this particular jointer is located about my knee level. The other thing that I always find hard to answer is when someone says to me, there's a black or a green button and a red one. Which one turns it on? What do you think? Let's see. Red stop sign on. Come on. If it's black, that's going to be your on switch. If it's green, it's going to be your on switch. And red, of course, always means that I'm going to stop. So that's my on-off switch, my guard, my fence. And we'll talk about these things which are going to give us the essence of this machine. I have, where I start, this little ditty called an in-feed table. The in-feed table, believe it or not, is slightly above the height of the out-feed table. The question is, how much higher is it above it? If you look at the cutter, the height of this knife is exactly, not sort of or close to, it is exactly the same height as that out-feed table. Come on with me. Cameraman, don't trip over the cord. Here's my in-feed table. This is where I'm going to start pushing. Here's my out-feed table where the board will end up. My board is on here. As I start to push into the cutter, it starts to cut. The important thing that you realize is these cannot be the same height, because if the out-feed table was the same height as the in-feed table, you would cut halfway through the board. I would be cutting halfway through the board, and at that point, if these were the same height, the board would drop down and this side would go up. So as a result, you would only joint at an angle to where you start. So it's important that you realize that the outfeed table picks up this exact amount that you cut out with the cutting knives. So the highest point that this knife is at is exactly the point that that outfeed table is at. The outfeed table is never adjustable. Never adjustable, because this jackass spent all summer lining that up and making sure it's absolutely perfect for you. That's right, for you. So watch the universal symbol for it's not adjustable. The in-feed table is adjustable, and something you should know about the in-feed table. That is set right now to cut off about a 32nd to a 64th of an inch. We want to take off as little as we possibly can. The most that you could take off is about a 16th of an inch. And the more you cut off, the more the machine is going to sound differently. So we want to take off as little as we possibly can to try to maintain the width of that board. But when you're jointing it, realize you're only taking a slight shavings off. The other thing to keep in mind, if you don't joint properly, and I've seen people do this, if you put the weight of your hands and your body not on the back end of the board, but on the front end of the board, the back end goes up, you will start jointing at an angle. And these are little idiosyncrasies that I have realized because I've worked with that machine for 40 years. You have to keep all your weight on the back end of the board. If I put pressure on the front, the back end goes up and it will start to joint at an angle. I have seen people joint boards that will look literally like that. And they'll say, hey, this back end isn't jointing. You want to make sure that your weight is completely towards the back end of the board, and that will give you a nice straight cut. I want to go back to the joiner, and I'll show you how to do this. The jointer is original to the school, which means it's a direct drive motor. This motor right here propels that cutting head and knife. So it's not slowed by any belts, any brakes. So when I turn this on, it's going to take about probably a minute and a half to come to its complete stop. With that in mind, you never ever want to take the guard, pull it away, and stick your finger into the cutting knives. And I had one student do that. And when I asked, after some of that finger was cut off, why she did that, she said to me, I thought it was off. I've been here for 40 years. I have never pulled a guard away from a machine, stuck my finger in there because I thought that it was off. Why would you do that? So you always want to make sure the guard is in place. Always make sure that you use good safety practices. Sleeves rolled up, safety glasses on, and I'm always going to position myself away from the cutter of this to make sure that I don't experience kickback. Let's come over and we're going to joint the board. There's many boards that I have pulled out. The first one that I want to show you has to do with the grain. If you look at this board, and I've kind of accentuated this by putting pencil marks, this will dictate how I joint this board simply because of the fact that the grain is running at a slight angle down. The best way I could liken this is petting a dog. If I were to joint, I always want to joint downhill, which means that if I start jointing in this direction here, I'm going uphill into the direction of the grain. Sometimes it will make a chippy noise. I think on a previous video, there was chipping that was going on, and I took the board and I flipped it around. Well, I'm going to plan ahead on this board. I'm not going to start at the low point. I'm actually going to start at the high point. So if I were to joint this board, I would select to joint it this way, and you could see with the grain running that way, I'm going downhill. So that's number one. I'm looking at this board. It doesn't look like there's anything in the way, no knots, no nails, no glue, so that's good. Something to keep in mind. The jointer is only used to joint an edge. That's the question on your quiz. I mean, the second question on your quiz. When you joint, I'm never going to joint an end. Someone said to me, how come I can't joint an end? If you look, the grain is running in this direction. The cutter is running in this direction. Everything will be okay until I get to the very end of that cut. Because with the cutter running in this direction, it's going to take this board and it's going to chip it. Also, by running an end on this jointer, it does not square it up. The only way it's going to be squared up is if you take the machined edge, put it up against the fence of the miter saw or radial arm saw, and then cut, because we know that that's at exactly 90 degrees. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose to joint this board in this direction. Another thing I want to show you. When I joint with the jointer, it's important that you understand that you can't take every piece of wood and joint on here. On top of this, I have a plastic guard, and I've taped it 1,000,000 times, but it says nothing shorter than this, which means I have made you a little guide. If I wanted to joint this board, can I safely do this on here? I don't think so. If that happens, notice that there's a space between the in-feed table and the out-feed table, about 1 inch or so. If I take a small board and I start to push this in, it's really easy as I push this in for this to drop. If this drops, this becomes a projectile, which means when we talk about kickback on the table saw, kickback can occur here. Anybody who's ever working with machines like this should realize that kickback happens when I push a board through and it doesn't want to go. It's going to come back from where it came, which means I never ever want to stand here, especially if you are male and especially if you're about 6'1". Everything seems to line up. So what I always want to do is take one step off to the left-hand side. Do I joint this board? As we say in Linden, hell no. Too short. So I'll put it in the scrap pile. Let me select my board that I'm going to joint. take a look at this. Pine, I don't need to joint. Here's the board that I had before. I'm going to joint this piece. When I do this, I'm going to select the better of the two edges. Once I do that, I look at the direction of the grain. Notice it's going this way. So this is the direction to joint downhill. What I would normally tell you to do is to take your right thumb and put it on the back end of the board. Your right hand goes up against the surface. So this is steadying the board up against the surface and the table. I'm going to slide it back as I cut. My right thumb is on the back end of the board, but this is a particular issue here because it's wide board. If I wanted to joint this board, same exact way. If I put my right thumb on the back end of the board, this board, chances are, will shake like a dog crapping razor blades. I don't want to do that. So on a wide board, instead of putting my hand at the top end, I would usually drop it about the level of the fence. To show you this, I'm going to use a little narrower board. Hold on. I'm going to joint this board. This is a typical board that I would joint. Crappy edge, better of the two edges. I'm going to joint this board, look at the grain. Downhill is in this direction, nothing in the way. This is a typical jointing job that you should be able to do. Making sure I hold the board off, I start the machine up. Glasses, sleeves rolled up. My left hand holds the stock up against the fence, right thumb on the back end of the board, 4 fingers on the top edge. I'm going to grit my teeth and I'm going to push this down. When my hand goes over the cutter, slide my left hand back, slide my left hand back. Now I'm going to go all the way through. So if I look at this, I heard a sound across this entire edge. This edge is super smooth and super clean. So that's in the movies, everything works out perfect. I put an X on that edge, I'm done. Let's look at things that aren't so perfect. I want to joint this here narrow board. If I take the narrow board, put the board here, right thumb on the back end of the board, you notice my thumb is at the same level as that board. A little dangerous. So watch the way the smart guy does it. Reaches over here, gets a push block. I'll use my left hand the same exact way, keeping it up against the fence. I'll slide my left hand as I go. I start it up, hold on to my board, up against the fence and the table, in feed table. My push block is on the back, left hand on the stock, and I start to push it. When my hand gets close to the guard, I'll move it back, I'll move it back, I'll move it back. All my weight's on the back end. And the most important thing I can tell you is that when I listen for sound and I hear a nice even sound all the way across, that's the indicator I'm successful with my joint. So that'll be your question on this quiz is, how can you tell you, that will be the third question on this quiz. How can I tell when the board is completely jointed? When I hear a noise all the way across the entire edge. Again, I put an X on that. I lay this on the table. I'm ready to make a cut. Any other questions? What? Longboard? How do we join a longboard? I do. Well, I do have a longboard. Right here. I'm going to joint this edge, and it's going to be a little bit more complicated, but not that much. I don't think I need my push block anymore. I'm going to choose the better of the two edges. Hey, not on a piece of cherry. I'm going to avoid this. I'm going to choose this edge over here. So I'm going to take my board, If I position this on the jointer and I put my right hand all the way on the back end, this is a royal pain in the can. So here's the way I'll do it. I'm going to use the technique of one hand over the other. I take the board, place it down on the table and on the fence. I'm going to position my hands on the top, and what I'll do is I push it through. I'm going to take my left hand, put it in back of my right, right and back of my left, left and back of my right, right and back of my left until I get to the very end. That's the easiest way to joint a long board, and I'll do it for you. Left and right. When my hand goes over the cutter, I slide it in back of my right. Hand is over the cutter, in back of my left. Hand over the cutter, in back of my right. Hand over the cutter, in back of my left. Now you notice I'm positioned exactly the way I was originally. Slide my left hand back. I'm going to send my board all the way through. And I, of course, heard a sound all the way across. This edge is now cleaned and true. X, this one is ready to go. I have my wide board. If you look at it, I just glued it up. So what I want to do is, I want to make this end 90 degrees. So what I'm going to do is choose the better of the two ends, which looks like this one, and...
No, you're not supposed to.
So you've been watching! I cannot joint this end. There's no reason it wouldn't serve any purpose. So I'm going to take this bad boy after it's been glued up. I go over to the miter saw, and I'm going to square the end with the miter saw, radial arm saw, chop saw, whatever you have. Then what I can do is I can go over to the table saw. Once this end has been trued, I can actually cross cut it to the length I need it to be. So if we go over a quick review. Let me check out my technological iPad. I never joint end grain. I never join a board less than 8 inches long. That's my own safety. I never stand directly in back of this. I never make a cut deeper than a 1/16 of an inch. My stock should always be clean. I always choose the better of the two edges. If it's a narrow board, I'm always going to use a push block or a push stick. You can walk with your board as you go along. In other words, if you have a real long board and you get to the end, don't stand here like you're glued in cement. You walk with it. Always try to go downhill along the grain like you're petting a dog. I go from the head down to the tail. If I go from the tail up, if I pet a dog, the hair goes up. You want to keep your mind on your work. Again, you're always thinking, which is the best edge I can use this? I always keep pressure on the back end of the board. And when I do this, after I finish, I allow the machine to come to a complete stop. Let's see, if I just do this, okay, I see. You should be able to join a board. You should be able to put that X on the board. And the next thing you want to do is make an edge parallel to the edge that you just jointed by taking a short walk over to the table saw. I always like to joint the board and then rip it to width. The advantage to that is if I were to go over to the miter saw square and then cut it to length, I could run the risk of using the wrong edge up against the fence. Because remember, we know this is machined. Chances are, if it's a piece of hardwood, this opposite edge is not machined. If I go over to the miter saw and I put an unmachined edge up against the fence, it won't be square. Next lesson, table saw. We'll finish this board, we'll rip our pieces, then we'll make another project. You guys have a great evening, and I'm always thinking of you.